The night Maren almost died. She was more worried about the quarterly ledger than her own blood pressure. That probably said everything about the state of her life at 28. She'd been at her desk until 11, not because Crowe demanded it, though he did implicitly, in the way powerful men always did, through silence and expectation, and the particular way his jaw tightened when a number didn't sit right. She'd stayed because the discrepancy in the Eastern accounts was bothering her. $43,000 shifted in increments, small enough to look like rounding errors. Small enough that anyone else would have missed it. Maren didn't miss things. It was the only skill she had that was worth anything, and she'd sharpened it the way other women sharpened their looks. Out of necessity, because nothing else was going to save her. She'd printed the flagged report, tucked it into a manila folder, locked her desk, and walked out into a November that had decided February was a better idea. She didn't have a car. She'd sold it 6 months ago when the transmission went and the repair estimate came back higher than 2 months of rent. The bus stop was 4 blocks from Crowe Industries' back entrance, which she used because the front entrance had a camera that faced the street, and she preferred not to be on cameras. Old habit. The kind you developed when you grew up in a house where people regularly needed to not be found. The folder was under her arm. Her coat was the wrong weight for the cold. She was thinking about the $43,000. She wasn't thinking about the 2 men who'd been watching the building. She became aware of them at the corner of 5th and Alderman, when the footsteps behind her shifted from incidental to deliberate. The kind of shift you feel in your sternum before your brain processes it. She didn't speed up. Speeding up telegraphed fear, and fear was an invitation. She'd learned that early too. What she did was turn left instead of right, toward the lit stretch of Hannigan Street, where the late-night diner kept its sign on until 2 in the morning. They turned with her. Her heart rate climbed. She kept her face forward, kept her pace measured, counted her breaths the way her mother had taught her when things got bad. In for 4, out for 4, don't let them see your hands shake. She made it to the diner. She pushed through the door. She sat at the counter and ordered coffee she didn't want. And through the window she watched the 2 men slow on the sidewalk outside, look at each other and keep walking. She sat there for 40 minutes. The coffee went cold. The waitress refilled it twice without being asked, with the particular understanding of women who've worked night, shifts long enough to recognize the look on another woman's face. When Maren finally left, she took the long route. 12 blocks instead of 4, through streets she knew, past the Astor, where Mr. Elgin kept the light on in the back room, past the laundromat with the broken O in its sign that had been broken for 3 years. She catalogued them the way she catalogued numbers. Landmarks, reference points, proof that the world was still organized in a way that made sense. Her apartment building had a buzzer that didn't work and a lobby that smelled like someone had cooked fish every day for a decade. She took the stairs because the elevator was slower than she liked when she was already on edge. 3rd floor, end of the hall, door with the dead bolt, and the secondary chain lock she'd installed herself with a YouTube tutorial and a hand drill she'd borrowed from Elgin's hardware store. She got inside. She locked both locks. She set the folder on the kitchen table. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, which was cold and slightly sticky from a cleaning she'd been putting off, and she let her hands shake. She didn't know Crowe knew where she lived. That was her first mistake. Assuming that because she hadn't told him, he didn't know. Men like Crowe didn't wait to be told things. They already knew things, and then they waited, with the patience of people who understood that information was a long game. She'd been working for him for 14 months, brought in by a staffing agency, initially assigned to the accounts receivable department, moved to internal auditing after 3 months because she'd flagged an error that the senior auditor had missed. The senior auditor hadn't appreciated that. Crowe had. He'd called her into his office on a Tuesday. She remembered it was Tuesday because she'd had a bad Tuesday, spilled coffee on her blouse, and had to spend the afternoon with her blazer buttoned all the way up, sweating. And he'd looked at her across a desk that probably cost more than her car had, and he'd said, "You have a very inconvenient talent, Miss Eliot." "Sir," she'd said, "you find things that shouldn't be found. That's either very useful or very dangerous." He'd tilted his head slightly, assessing. "I haven't decided which yet." She'd said, "I find things that are there to be found. The inconvenience is someone else's problem." He'd been quiet for a moment. Then he'd said, "You're promoted. Come see my assistant on your way out for the paperwork." She'd come to understand over 14 months that this was how Crowe operated. Minimal words, maximum weight. He didn't explain his decisions. He made them and expected the world to rearrange itself accordingly. Most of the time it did. She'd also come to understand that Crowe Industries was not a conventional company. She'd known this before she took the job. She wasn't naive, and the staffing agency had a particular clientele. But knowing a thing abstractly and knowing it in the specific were different. The Eastern accounts she'd been auditing weren't retail receivables. The men who came and went from the building's lower floors weren't IT contractors. She'd kept her eyes on the numbers and her opinions to herself. That was the deal, implicit as all Crowe's demands. The $43,000 made it complicated. She went to work the next morning with the folder under her arm and circles under her eyes, and the distinct feeling that she was walking toward something she didn't fully understand. Crowe's building in the morning was different from the building at night. In the morning it had the performance of legitimacy. Receptionist, badge scanners, people in decent suits carrying decent coffees. Maren badged in, took the elevator to the 7th floor, sat at her desk, and opened her computer. The flagged report was still open on her screen from the night before. She stared at it. $43,000. Moved in 11 transactions over 60 days, each one just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic compliance flag. Whoever had done it knew the systems. Not perfectly. They'd left a trace in the timing patterns. A consistency that Maren had recognized the way you recognized a person's handwriting. But well enough that it would have slid past most people, it had not slid past Maren. The question was what she did about it. She could put it in a standard report and send it up the chain, which was procedure. The problem was that she didn't know where in the chain this had originated. If it was internal, if someone above her had moved this money, a standard report went directly to the person who'd moved it, and then Maren had a different kind of problem. She could go directly to Crowe. She'd never done that before. She communicated with him through his assistant, Petra. Not the Petra in the file, a different Petra, a severe woman in her 50s who treated every interaction as a potential security breach. But Crowe had been the one to promote her, and the promotion had come with a private line that Petra had given her, saying, "For genuine emergencies only. He will know if you misuse it." Maren had never used the line. She sat at her desk and thought about the men who'd followed her last night, and the 60 days of careful transactions, and the number 43,000, and she decided that this probably qualified. She picked up her desk phone. She dialed. It rang twice. Eliot. His voice was the same on the phone as in person, measured slightly low, with a flatness that wasn't coldness exactly, more like the deliberate removal of anything he didn't want you to hear. "I have something," she said. "In the accounts, 60 days, 11 transactions, 43,000. Someone who knows the threshold architecture." A pause. 2 seconds, maybe 3. She counted. "My office," he said. "Now." She didn't make it to his office. She was halfway down the hall, folder in hand, when the building's power went out. Not a flicker. A complete immediate cut. Lights, computers, the hum of the HVAC system, everything, replaced by the thinner, yellower light of the emergency backup, which in this building meant 2 strips of LED along the baseboard and the red glow of the exit signs. Maren stopped walking. In the sudden quiet, she heard something she shouldn't have heard. A stairwell door, 2 floors below, opening and closing too quickly, with the particular carefulness of someone trying not to be heard. She stood in the dim hallway and made a decision. She didn't go forward toward Crowe's office, which was the obvious destination for anyone watching her. She went sideways, through the door to her left, which was an internal conference room with no windows and 2 exits, a detail she'd catalogued on her first week, because she catalogued exits the way she catalogued numbers. She moved to the second exit, which opened onto the service corridor, and then she was moving fast. Folder pressed flat against her body, through the corridor toward the fire exit at the far end. She didn't run. Running made noise. She moved the way she'd learned to move through the apartment at night as a kid, when her father was home and quiet was its own kind of survival. Quick, light, purposeful. She was 3 feet from the fire exit when the door at the other end of the corridor opened. She didn't stop to look. She hit the crash bar on the fire exit, spilled into the stairwell, took the stairs 2 at a time going up. Not down, because down was where they'd expect her to go, and the roof was alarmed, but she could deal with an alarm. Up 3 flights to the roof access door, which was locked with a code she'd noticed a maintenance worker entering 2 months ago, and filed away because that was what her brain did. It filed things. And she punched in the code and pushed through into the cold. November air hit her like a hand to the face. She was on the roof. Below her, 9 floors down, was the street. Across from her, the building's mechanical room, a low concrete structure with a door that was probably also locked. It was. She stood with her back against the mechanical room wall, folder clutched to her chest, and breathed. Then she looked at her phone. No signal. She'd expected that. She looked at the folder. $43,000. She thought about what that number might be worth to someone. Then she heard the roof access door open. He came through it first. Crowe. She knew his silhouette before she saw his face. The particular set of his shoulders, the way he moved, which was not at all like a man who'd just climbed 9 flights of stairs quickly, though he clearly had. He was in his shirt sleeves, which meant he'd been at his desk when things had gone wrong, and his shirt was good. She'd learned to read the quality of men's shirts without meaning to, but he had a gun in his right hand, held low, and his eyes found her in the dim grey light almost immediately. He stopped, looked at her. "You went up," he said. They'd expect down. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, not quite satisfaction, something between them. He moved past her to look over the roof's edge down at the street below. His expression didn't change. 2 on the ground, probably 2 more still in the building. He looked back at her. "Who knows you found it? No one. I called you directly. You haven't filed a report. Obviously not." He looked at her for a moment. She met his gaze without flinching, which she'd learned was the only way to handle Crowe. Anything that looked like weakness confirmed a hypothesis he'd been running since the day they met, and she didn't intend to confirm it. "Give me the folder," he said. She handed it over. He looked at the first page, then the second, and his jaw tightened in the way it did when numbers didn't sit right. But this time it was different. This time the tightening had a quality she'd only seen in him once before, when someone had given him information that had cost him something personal. "How long have you known?" he said. "I flagged it last night. I was here until 11. That's not what I asked." He looked up from the folder. "How long have you suspected something was wrong in that account?" She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was 3 weeks. She'd seen the first ghost of it 3 weeks ago, and had told herself it was probably nothing, probably her own pattern-seeking brain finding shapes in noise, because the alternative was that something was genuinely wrong inside Crowe's organization, and she didn't want to be the one holding that information. 3 weeks, she said, another of his pauses. 2 seconds, 3. "Why didn't you say something?" "I wasn't sure. You're always sure." He said it without heat, which made it worse, a flat statement of what he believed about her. "You catalogue and you verify and then you act. You don't wait when you're sure." She looked at him. I didn't know who to trust. The pause this time was longer. 5 seconds. 6. "Fair," he said finally. "Just that." And somehow it landed differently than she expected. Below them, a car alarm was going off on the street. Crowe looked over the edge again, then toward the roof access door, calculating something she couldn't see. "There's a secondary exit," he said. "Service ladder on the west side, comes down into the alley. My car is 2 blocks east." He was already moving. "Stay close. Don't run. If I tell you to stop, you stop. And if I tell you to stop," she said. He looked back at her. It was the closest thing to surprise she'd ever seen on his face. A fractional pause, a slight alteration around his eyes. Then, "I'll consider it," which, from Crowe, was probably the most she was going to get. The ladder was exactly where he said it was. It was also cold enough that gripping the iron rungs felt like holding something that was trying to damage her hands. She didn't say anything about this. She went down. He went down after her, still with the gun, which he kept in one hand while descending with a facility that suggested he'd done this specific thing before. The alley smelled like old restaurant grease and cold concrete. There was a dumpster. There was a loading door that had been painted shut some time in the previous decade. There was nothing else. They moved quickly, east, through the alley, and then a cut-through between buildings and then out onto a side street that Maren had walked 100 times on lunch breaks. But that looked different now, in the pale morning light, with a man with a gun at her shoulder and the specific awareness that something significant was happening. The car was a black sedan, understated for a man of Crowe's resources, which was probably the point. He opened the back door, and she got in, and he got in beside her, and the driver, a man she'd seen once before in the building's lower floors, who had a quality of stillness that meant something in this world, pulled out without being told. She sat with her hands in her lap. The folder was still with Crowe. "Where are we going?" she said. "Safe house." "For now, how long is for now?" He looked at her. The light in the car was different from office light, less managed, less deliberate. She could see the scar along his jaw that she'd noticed before, but never directly acknowledged, and the grey that had started at his temples, and the way he held the folder, the particular tightness of it, like it was evidence in a case he'd already been building in his own head. "That depends on what else you know," he said. "I know what's in that folder, and—" She looked at him. He looked back. Outside the window, the city moved past them, ordinary and indifferent. People on their way to jobs and schools and errands, people who didn't know what $43,000 could mean inside the right set of accounts. "I know it's not just the Eastern accounts," she said. "I think the Western segment has the same pattern, smaller, less consistent. Someone was practicing on the East before they moved to the West. Something happened in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like the recognition of something he'd suspected. "When did you find the Western segment? Last night?" "Around 10. That's when I called you this morning." He looked at the folder again. She watched him the way she watched numbers. Not intrusively, but steadily, cataloguing. His breathing was even. His hands were still. But the jaw had that quality again, that tightness, and something around his eyes had shifted into a register she'd only seen in him once, when a meeting had gone wrong in a way that had cost him someone he cared about. This was personal. "You know who it is," she said. Not a question. She didn't phrase things as questions when she was certain, and he looked at her. A long moment. "Then I have a name. Is it someone I would recognize?" "No. Is it someone in the building?" The pause this time was the longest yet. "It was," he said. The safe house was a brownstone in a neighborhood she didn't know, which meant it was probably in a part of the city where Crowe's presence wasn't unusual. The driver took them around the block once before stopping. Crowe checked something on his phone. Then they went inside. It was not what she expected from safe house. She'd expected something stripped down, functional. What she found was a place that had been lived in, not by Crowe or, if by him then, a version of him she hadn't seen, but lived in, with books that had been actually read, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee from earlier in the morning, and a room off the main hall where someone had left a lamp on. She stood in the entry and said, "This isn't just a safe house." "No," he said. "Whose is it?" "Mine." He set the folder on a side table. "I used to stay here more than I do now." He looked around the room with an expression she couldn't categorize. Before the main property. She thought about asking more and decided against it. Some edges were worth leaving alone. He disappeared into the kitchen. She heard the sound of a coffee maker beginning. She took off her coat and stood in the room with the books and the lamp, and she looked at the titles on the shelf. Not classics arranged for display, but paperbacks and worn hardcovers and a handful of technical manuals, the kind of shelf that reflected actual reading rather than the performance of it. And she thought about the fact that she was in Crowe's house and had been followed last night, and was probably in a different kind of danger than she'd been in when she woke up this morning. He came back with 2 coffees. He handed her one without asking how she took it, which should have been presumptuous but wasn't, because it was black, and black was correct, and she suspected he'd noticed this the same way she noticed things. "Sit down," he said. She did, on the edge of the couch. He sat across from her, in a chair that had the quality of a chair he'd sat in many times before. "I need to know everything you found," he said. "Sequence it for me, from the first moment you noticed something." So she did. It took 40 minutes. She laid it out the way she laid out everything, methodically, without editorializing, fact by fact by fact. She told him about the 3 weeks ago, the first ghost of the pattern. She told him about the 11 transactions, the specific amounts, the intervals, the way the timing had a signature to it that she could recognize, the way she recognized a voice. She told him about the Western accounts, smaller and less consistent, and her theory about the practice-run nature of the Eastern segment. She told him about the 2 men from last night, the diner, the long route home. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You went home, yes, after being followed. I lost them. You lost them by going to a diner and waiting 40 minutes. It worked. Maren." He almost never used her first name. She became aware of this as it happened, the specific quality of it, different from the way he said Eliot, which was a designation. "The people who follow my employees don't follow them to take their wallets." She met his eyes. "I know that, and you went home." I had dead bolts. Something passed across his face that she didn't have a word for. It wasn't anger, or not only anger. It had a layer to it, a texture, that she wasn't certain she'd seen on him before. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked away, toward the window, and she saw his hand on the arm of the chair tighten briefly. "Starting today," he said to the window, "you don't go back to that apartment." She opened her mouth. "I'm not asking," he said, still to the window. Then he looked at her, and his expression was careful in the specific way that meant he was controlling something. "The person who moved that money knows someone found them. They know because the systems flagged your access to the affected accounts, and that information went to the wrong person before I could intercept it. That happened this morning, approximately 40 minutes before the power went out in the building." She absorbed this. "How long have you known?" 3 hours. "You should have told me. You were already walking down the hall. There wasn't time." He looked at her steadily. "This is me telling you now. The coffee was good." She noticed this because she noticed things, and the noticing of small ordinary goods felt important when other things were large and bad. She held the cup with both hands and thought about the apartment with the 2 dead bolts and the sticky kitchen floor and the folder on the table, and she thought about the fact that it probably wasn't safe to go back to any of it. "I can stay in a hotel," she said. "You can stay here," he said. She looked at him. "There are 3 bedrooms," he said, with a flatness that made it clear he was preempting an objection she hadn't quite formed yet. "The security here is better than anywhere else you'd find in the next 12 hours, and I need you accessible." "Accessible," she repeated. "The accounts. I'm going to need your recall in real time as we move through this. You're the only person I trust to hold the sequence correctly." She looked at him. "Is that the only reason?" The pause. 2 seconds, 3. He held her gaze with the evenness she'd come to expect from him, but underneath it, something she'd learned to watch for. A small calibration, the eyes holding a fraction of a second longer than necessary, the jaw fractionally less tight. "No," he said, "just that, flat." "True." She looked down at her coffee. The lamp in the corner made the room feel smaller, warmer. Outside, through the brownstone's front windows, the November light was thin and honest, the kind that didn't flatter anything, that showed what was actually there. "Okay," she said. He nodded once, slightly. Then he reached for the folder and opened it again, and they began. It took them 4 days. She would remember those 4 days in particular ways. The specific color of morning light through the brownstone windows, the sound of Crowe's voice at 2 in the morning, when they were both running on coffee, and the particular adrenaline of almost having it, The moment she found the secondary account that connected the internal transaction trail to an external routing number, and the way he had looked at her when she found it, which she kept in a part of her mind where she didn't examine things directly but was aware of their presence. The name, when it resolved fully, was someone she didn't recognize, as Crowe had said. A logistics director who had been with the organization for 7 years. A man who had been careful, who had been patient, who had made one error in the timing pattern that Maren's particular brain had caught on a Tuesday in October when she was cataloging accounts late at night with bad coffee and worse lighting. Crowe made calls. She didn't ask about the calls. On the 4th night he came into the kitchen where she was still working. She was usually still working. When he came back, the accounts had a gravitational pull that she'd stopped apologizing for, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, and she looked up. "It's done," he said. She looked at him. He looked tired in a way he didn't usually show, the tightness around his eyes, the set of his shoulders. Done meant something specific in his world, and she understood what it meant without asking. "Are you all right?" she said. He seemed slightly surprised by the question. "Yes." That's not a real answer. He looked at her for a moment. Then he came into the kitchen and sat down across from her at the table, which he hadn't done before. He'd always stayed in the doorway, maintaining a specific distance, and she'd catalogued this as she catalogued everything. But now he sat, and he set his hands flat on the table, and he said, "He was someone I trusted. 7 years." He looked at his hands. "You don't think, after 7 years?" He stopped. She waited. Pushing Crowe was counterproductive. He arrived at things in his own time, in his own way. "You think you can read people," he said, "after long enough. You think you know what they are. Sometimes you're wrong," she said. "I'm not usually wrong." "No," she agreed, "but you were this time, and that's allowed, even for you." She said it without inflection, factual, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not quite relief, but adjacent to it, the look of a person who's been waiting for someone to tell them the truth without softening it. "You're very blunt," he said. "You've mentioned. I didn't mean it as a complaint." A pause. "The first time I didn't mean it as a complaint." She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was quiet around them, just the hum of the refrigerator and the low sound of rain that had started earlier in the evening. "You need to sleep," she said. "So do you. I will. I need to close out these segments first." He nodded, slowly, like he understood this, not as an excuse, but as a genuine need, the same way she understood his particular silences as not rudeness but thought. Something mutual she recognized in the way they operated, a specific compatibility that had nothing to do with liking each other, exactly, and everything to do with seeing each other in a way that most people didn't manage. He stood. He picked up her empty cup and took it to the sink and rinsed it, which was such an ordinary gesture that it caught her slightly sideways, the mundane courtesy of it. Then he said, "When you're done, there's a section in the main account I've had questions about for a year. Different ledger. I'd like your eyes on it if you're willing." She looked at the stack of folders on the table. She looked at the rain moving down the window. "Put it on the table," she said. "I'll start in the morning." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Thank you, Maren. First name again." She noted it, catalogued it, set it carefully in the part of her mind where she kept things she intended to understand better later. "Get some sleep, Crowe," she said. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before he turned away, and she turned back to the accounts, and outside the rain kept on, honest and steady, and the number 43,000, which had started all of this, sat in her mind like a key that had already done its work and could now be set quietly down.